Well, with hearings underway to review the success of Sydney's controversial lockout laws, new polling conducted by YouGov Galaxy shows overwhelming public support for a closing time for pubs, clubs and bars of no later than 3 a.m, while 76% of New South Wales adults believe more needs to be done to prevent alcohol harm. Joining me now live to discuss is the Chief Executive of the Foundation for Alcohol Research, Michael Thorn. Michael, good to see you. Thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Thank you for having me on.
Firstly, let's break down these figures. 4 out of 5 residents support a closing time for pubs. Take us through it.
Well, I think that it's really interesting that so many people are overwhelmingly supportive of the measures that were introduced by the O'Farrell government back in January 2014. It's been a consistent high level of support. In fact, we polled just before O'Farrell made those big announcements and found 71% of people in New South Wales supported the package of measures that the government ultimately announced, and that's just consistently risen in the intervening years. So it's pretty pleasing, I think, from a resident's point of view. It's pretty pleasing, certainly from a doctor's and a first responders' point of view, because they are seeing fewer people hurt and having to be admitted to hospital as a consequence of alcohol-fuelled violence. And I'm not surprised, frankly, and I think that one of the standout figures in this polling is the very high level of support for the overall package of measures, and 90% of those in the 18 to 24-year-old bracket supporting last drinks at 3 a.m. So it's a good news story, I think, for everyone.
Were you surprised that there was such a high result between the age bracket of 18 to 24?
Well, I was a bit surprised, because there certainly has been a consistent and persistent campaign by some in the in the Sydney community, particularly those who kind of hook their caravan to live music, that young people really don't want these measures and want to go back to the situation that prevailed before the O'Farrell government introduced these restrictions. And so, yes, but I think that what that's reflecting is the overall change, many changes that go beyond just the patterns of drinking that we saw in King's Cross, leading to the deaths of Thomas Kelly and Daniel Christie, for instance. Everyone's moved on, and I think that those who continue to criticise the lockouts and the last drinks measures need to move on too. They need to focus on the other things that make Sydney a great city, a global city.
There obviously has been a lot of debate in recent times about these controversial lockout laws. The hospitality industry itself is one that has perhaps suffered the most because of them. What would you say to those who are in the hospitality industry and have had to close up shop because their business has gone bust?
Look, I don't want to kind of be a bit of a damp blanket, as it were, on the claims by some of the hospitality industry, but some of the claims are not credible. And certainly the Sydney City Council is not helping matters with some of the data that they're pushing in about the state of the economy. There was a major report by Lord Mayors of Australia on all the capital cities' nighttime economies, and Sydney has been shown to be consistently the most prosperous nighttime economy in the country. Now, that's not just about the bars, for instance, or the pubs and clubs. This is about the entire city. And so I think we have to be careful when we look at some of the claims that are made by the hospitality sector that these lockout laws have been responsible for the closures of business. Whenever I see these particular claims, I write to people and ask them to provide me with evidence that the lockout laws have actually been responsible for the closure of the business. Only one person has responded to me, and that was the former mayor of Randwick, and he said he'd got his information from the newspapers. So I think that what we need to be very careful about these claims. These sorts of nighttime entertainment economies are always changing. People start businesses and then close up and go away because they can't make it operate, can't make a success of it. So we just need to be careful about the kind of changing economic circumstances that we're seeing in Sydney and other cities around the world, for instance, because there are a lot of things impacting it, including the economic conditions, the fact that wages are not growing, the fact that people's way that they consume music is changing. There's a whole range of other factors that are bearing on the economic success of the hospitality sector.
We've also seen new figures out this week showing that while lockout laws themselves have reduced alcohol-related violence and non-domestic assaults, say in the King's Cross area, they've risen in places like Coogee, Newtown and Double Bay, where, of course, these are outside the lockout zone. Is it time to perhaps reevaluate these areas?
Look, I think it definitely is. Those figures that were released on Friday by the New South Wales Bureau of Crime Stats were very surprising, because we'd all been operating on the basis that there'd been no displacement of the violence from King's Cross and Sydney CBD into neighbouring areas. Now, this is new information, and it does mean that we need to re-look at the policy settings in those areas, and it would suggest once again that if people have moved to those other areas, that they continue to be high levels of intoxication. It's not surprising that we would see rising rates of violence, emergency department presentations and hospitalisations. So yes, I think it is time to have a good hard look at the policy settings in those adjoining areas.
Just finally, as part of the YouGov Galaxy poll, it found that 76% of New South Wales adults believe that more needs to be done to help prevent alcohol harm. Can you take us through some other ways that we can do this?
Well, look, I'm glad you asked that, because from my perspective, too much focus is on these sort of problems in nighttime economies. Most of the harm that it is attributable to the consumption of alcohol has nothing to do with people going to pubs and clubs. It's long-term harm arising from kind of consistent drinking. And we have a situation in Australia where about 20% of Australian adults are responsible for 75% of all the alcohol that's consumed. And that leads to the diseases that are the majority, are responsible for the majority of the alcohol harm. But we should also remember there are enormous problems with alcohol-related family violence, for instance. There are nearly a million kids affected by their carers drinking every year. 10,000 of those are in the child protection system as a consequence of their carers drinking. So I think that the 76% figure reflects the community's broader concerns about the use of alcohol and the consumption of alcohol in Australia.